Hi, folks. I've been asked whether I think that Ronald Reagan won the Cold War. Um, and the response to that's a little bit nuanced. I think that certainly Reagan gets some credit for Western victory in the Cold War and the ultimate collapse of the Soviet Union. Uh, Reagan, early in his term as president, actually sort of frightened a lot of people by the very harshness of his rhetoric toward the Russians. He described them as evil, and how can you negotiate with somebody uh, who you're calling evil? So Reagan ratchets up military spending. He uses this very harsh rhetoric, and many people thought that Reagan might just uh, tilt us all the way into a crisis, into potential World War III. Um, uh, I think consistently many critics and observers of Reagan um, uh, might have underestimated him in certain ways. Reagan has multiple facets. Um, he wasn't an intellectual, and I think many smart people looked at Ronald Reagan and said that he's such a simple, simplistic person. There's so many areas that he doesn't know that much about, and that comes out during his statements. Um, uh, but I don't think Ronald Reagan lost a presidential debate. um, he would take down his opponents again and again. Um I think through just his ability as a communicator, but also his skill in condensing issues into very kind of simple terms. People talk about Abraham Lincoln as lawyer. That was one of Lincoln's abilities in the courtroom, was he'd get in front of a jury and take complicated matters and communicate them through analogies, sometimes stories, and people would understand. And so Ronald Reagan starts out with this harsh rhetoric, and we had détente during the 1970s, this effort to scale back the Cold War hostilities by talking to the Russians and passing arms limitations treaties. Reagan initially doesn't seem interested in talking to the Russians, and that frightens people. But then he turns around and begins a whole series of summits with the new young head of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. And I think what happened was, after a series of elderly Russian leaders who followed each other in kind of quick succession, suddenly had this younger man who, in American terms, was a baby boomer, someone too young to have been shaped by the Second World War. And I think that Reagan saw an opportunity in Gorbachev. And so the two men engage in a series of meetings. I think the first one was in Reykjavik in Iceland, and Reagan goes off with just a translator. He leaves all of his diplomatic staff behind, and he and Gorbachev go off alone. And I think many of the staffers are like, "Uh-oh, you know, um, what will happen when Reagan, who is not an expert on geopolitics or anything like that, what's going to happen when he's alone with Gorbachev? Maybe he's going to be taken apart by him." So it's real concern. And hours tick by, and then Ronald Reagan reemerges, and in effect, he and Gorbachev establish what amounts to sort of a diplomatic friendship. The two men get to know each other and apparently liked each other. And so that becomes the basis for further talks and further engagement. And Gorbachev was someone who realized that the Soviet Union had to back away from kind of the Stalinist, harsh communist conditions that most Russian people had tired of. And so Gorbachev is busy with glasnost and perestroika, more openness, less rigid control within Russia. And Reagan is cheering this on, but he doesn't stop his arms buildup. And quite dramatically, at one point, Ronald Reagan comes on television and announced he had been through one of these presidential nuclear drills in which they put the president into an airplane and fly him at high altitude and simulate what we would do in the event of a Soviet strike on the United States with nuclear weapons, and Reagan's asking questions about, well, what's gonna happen? What's going to be the casualty rates, and what's the likely scenario on the other side, and are we going to go back to Washington? And it's clear that no, Washington is gone at this point. Washington's been incinerated. We'll probably fly you to some remote place, up on the northern plains or Alaska or someplace like that. Reagan hears these realities, and later he said that he came to the conclusion that nuclear war couldn't really be won, that everyone's going to lose, and therefore it shouldn't be fought. And so Reagan comes back from this experience, and he announces on television that he started the Strategic Defense Initiative, what pundits referred to as Star Wars. He said, we're going to build a ground and space-based missile defense system, a grid covering North America that's going to intercept and knock down any Soviet missiles that are fired at us. And so we'll still have the deterrence of our nuclear arsenal, but in the event that the Russians lose their mind, basically, and throw everything at us, we'll be able to survive. And so the reality is that we didn't have any of the technology necessary, that it was going to be years, maybe decades, to develop the kinds of weapons, defensive weapons, that could actually do this. Reagan didn't care about details. He's not a scientist. He's not a technologist. He just said, I want this. Go do it. And meanwhile, analysts in the Soviet Union, in Moscow, are watching all of this, and they're telling Mikhail Gorbachev, I think in part based upon Reagan's demeanor. Experts can watch, someone when they're speaking and assess their mannerisms, their movements, their posture, and you can tell when people are being deceptive. And these Russian experts are coming back and they're telling their bosses, no, Ronald Reagan is being truthful. He is saying he's not being deceptive. This isn't a trick. He believes that the United States is going to do this. And then Gorbachev apparently asks his scientists, what's our prospect for matching the United States? And they say, we're not anywhere close. Apparently the Americans have made a fundamental leap in technology, and we've been left behind. And afterwards, many people said that this contributed to the ultimate collapse of the Soviet Union, that Russian leaders began realizing that they'd lost the Cold War militarily. With that said, though, I think you have to credit all the American presidents since Harry Truman for the outcome of the Cold War. And remember, the Cold War doesn't end under Ronald Reagan. It ends under George Herbert Walker Bush. So actually, you have people who are defenders or advocates for the Bush presidency who say, no, we ended the Cold War. It's like, well, that's not very convincing either. Just because it happened on your watch doesn't mean that you did it. But we should keep in mind that no one within the United States, in the CIA or in other intelligence agencies, had any idea that the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse. And I would argue that it's probably more an internal collapse. I think that events taking place in Eastern Europe and within Russian society deserve a lot more credit than the United States on the outside and what we did. We certainly made the situation in Russia much more economically difficult by forcing them to try to match our spending. But I think that as Americans, we tend to overestimate how much we kind of are the puppet masters around the world. And in reality, I don't believe that that's really the case. So hope you had a good week. Enjoy your weekend, and I'll talk to you later.